Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Complex Cine channel. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and give us a like. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Kembali Berdiri. The film unfolds with a palpable sense of ambition, centering on a figure whose journey is deeply etched with the highs and lows of creative pursuit. We see early glimpses of this protagonist navigating the demanding landscape of Indonesian cinema, a world where talent often contends with entrenched industry expectations. Their early work, perhaps a short film or an independent feature, already hinted at a distinctive visual style, a knack for capturing nuanced human emotion that set them apart from the more formulaic offerings of the time. This early success, however modest, fueled a relentless drive, an almost obsessive need to tell stories that resonated authentically with the Indonesian spirit, moving beyond mere commercial viability. As the narrative progresses, the focus shifts to a particular creative undertaking, a project that seems to represent the culmination of years of struggle and learning. This endeavor isn't just another film, it feels like a deeply personal excavation. We learn that the inspiration for this current work stems from a confluence of personal history and a desire to honor forgotten narratives within their community. One can sense the weight of influence from classic Indonesian auteurs, perhaps echoes of Teguh Karya's meticulous storytelling or the raw energy of early new wave directors, filtered through a thoroughly modern lens. The director's dedication is almost monastic. There are montages showing exhaustive research, lengthy, sometimes contentious, script revisions, and the meticulous sourcing of locations that speak volumes about their commitment to verisimilitude. The central conflict arises not just from the external pressures of financing or studio interference, the usual antagonists in any artistic biography, but from an internal battle. The protagonist grapples with self-doubt, the persistent whisper that perhaps their vision is too niche, too uncompromising for a mass audience. This introspection is beautifully contrasted with the vibrant, often chaotic energy of the film's set itself. We observe the interactions with the cast, many of whom are themselves striving artists, perhaps newcomers the director has taken under their wing, recognizing a similar spark they once possessed. There's a touching scene where the director shares an anecdote about an early mentor who once told them, "The camera sees the truth, but only if you allow yourself to see it first." The production phase is shown as arduous. Weather, logistical nightmares, and creative disagreements test the protagonist's resolve. Yet, in these moments of near collapse, their true character shines through. They possess an almost stubborn resilience, a refusal to dilute the core message for expediency. This tenacity isn't born of arrogance, but from a profound belief in the necessity of the story being told in exactly the way it demands. Their history, marked by periods of obscurity, followed by bursts of critical acclaim, has seasoned them, making them less susceptible to fleeting trends. The final act of the film focuses on the premiere and the immediate aftermath. The tension is almost unbearable as the credits roll. We see the protagonist observing the audience reaction, not with vanity, but with a searching gaze, trying to gauge if the intended emotional bridge has been successfully built. The reaction, when it comes, is not necessarily a sweeping, universal ovation, but rather a profound, quiet recognition from those who understand the layers of artistry involved. The film concludes not with a definitive pronouncement of victory, but with a subtle understanding. The act of creation itself, the struggle to stand again after being knocked down, that is the true triumph. The protagonist steps away from the fanfare, already perhaps contemplating the next challenge, forever the eternal student of the moving image. The protagonist, whom we might call Surya, carries the visible markers of his vocation. The slight, perpetual fatigue around the eyes, that speaks of countless sleepless nights spent poring over rushes, and hands often stained faintly with ink from hurried script notes. His early inspirations weren't just the giants of world cinema. He often spoke in interviews, which we catch glimpses of, about the powerful street photography of the 1970s Jakarta scene, the way those photographers captured the unvarnished reality of daily life, a realism he sought to translate into moving pictures. This desire for authenticity meant he often clashed with producers keen on importing slicker, more internationally palatable aesthetics. As Surya steers this new, deeply personal project, we see the toll it takes on his personal life, a familiar sacrifice for those whose art demands totality. There are brief, poignant scenes showing missed calls from family or a quiet dinner eaten alone in a sparse apartment, the glow of a monitor reflecting in his intense gaze. His second-in-command, perhaps a seasoned cinematographer who has weathered similar artistic storms, acts as a necessary anchor, their rapport built on years of shared near failures and small victories. This cinematographer, maybe named Bhima, has an eye for composition that perfectly complements Surya's thematic focus, understanding that a carefully placed shadow can carry more narrative weight than pages of dialogue. The emotional core of the production revolves around a pivotal performance. Surya has insisted on casting an unknown, someone whose lived experience mirrors the vulnerability of the character he has written. Watching Surya work with this novice actor is revealing. He sheds his usual guarded demeanor, becoming intensely empathetic, patiently coaxing out the necessary rawness. He doesn't direct through shouts, but through shared vulnerability, offering up pieces of his own past struggles to create a safe space for the actor to excavate deep emotion. This process is slow, agonizingly so, testing the patience of the financiers who demand faster turnaround times. When the film finally moves into post-production, the struggle shifts from the physical constraints of the location to the metaphysical challenge of editing. Surya battles with his editor over pacing. Surya wants lingering shots that allow the audience to breathe in the atmosphere, while the editor argues for the necessity of forward momentum to keep the narrative taut. These arguments are less about ego and more about the rhythm of truth. Surya believing that truth often resides in the pauses, the unspoken moments between actions. We witness him spending days alone in the editing suite, sometimes scrapping entire, technically perfect sequences because they felt, in his own words, like decoration rather than architecture. The critical reception following the premiere is a microcosm of his career itself. There are critics who laud it as a masterpiece of understated social commentary, recognizing the subtle cultural signifiers woven into the production design, details he fought fiercely to preserve, like the specific wear pattern on a decades-old teak table, or the correct shade of paint for a specific regional government office. Conversely, some reviews dismiss it as impenetrable, too slow, too focused on the particularities of a small community to resonate broadly. Surya reads these reviews with a strange detachment. The external validation, or lack thereof, seems secondary to the internal certainty that he has honored the story. His relief isn't exuberant, it's a settling of internal pressure, the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a treacherous creative journey and arrived at the intended destination, however few the travelers who choose to follow that path. The final image is not of applause, but of Surya, back in a quiet room, sketching the very first few frames of a new idea, the cycle of creation eternally beginning anew. The atmosphere surrounding Surya during the festival circuit, following the premiere, is a strange mix of suffocating proximity and utter isolation. He moves through the crowded lobbies of international film markets like a ghost, polite but distant, his focus clearly internalized. We see him fielding relentless questions, many of which inevitably steer toward the commercial prospects or potential for remake. Questions he answers with a practiced, almost weary courtesy that betrays his disdain for such metrics. His mannerisms speak volumes, a habit of constantly adjusting the frame of his eyeglasses, as if trying to bring a blurry world into sharper focus, or the way he unconsciously rubs his thumb over a worn patch on his jacket, a small talisman from an earlier, scrappier filmmaking period. His relationship with his collaborators deepens under this scrutiny. Bhima, the cinematographer, acts as his shield, handling the more overtly promotional interviews, translating Surya's dense artistic intentions into slightly more digestible sound bites. It is through Bhima's eyes that we often see the real cost, the subtle tremor in Surya's hand after a particularly intense Q&A session, or the moments when he retreats entirely, finding solace only in the familiar glow of his editing monitor, even months after the picture is locked. The narrative subtly weaves in flashbacks to Surya's formative years in film school, not just the academic pursuits, but the hunger that drove him. There are recollections of sneaking into closed studio archives, devouring reels of raw, unedited footage from Indonesia's post-independence era, mesmerized by the unself-conscious truth captured there. This early exposure cemented his philosophy that true national cinema must look inward, finding the universal within the intensely specific local context, a philosophy he inherited, perhaps from his early mentor who championed the raw, unpolished voice over studio gloss. One of the film's most emotionally resonant sequences, shown during a retrospective montage, details the struggle to secure a specific, crucial piece of music, a traditional gamelan composition that he felt held the key to the protagonist's spiritual landscape. The rights holders were initially resistant, viewing his project as too obscure to warrant the licensing fee. Surya's persistence in this instance wasn't about the money, it was about integrity. We see him spending weeks negotiating not through lawyers, but through personal appeal, sharing aspects of his own family's connection to that specific musical tradition, effectively turning a business negotiation into a shared cultural exchange. This small victory feels monumental, a quiet win against the forces that seek to commodify or erase cultural nuance. As the film reaches its quiet coda, Surya is not seen basking in any awarded laurels, though success is clearly implied through the shift in industry respect he now commands. Instead, he is engaged in a seemingly mundane task, visiting a small, independent cinema far from the major metropolitan hubs, watching his film projected for an audience composed mostly of older community members, the very people whose untold stories informed his work. He watches their faces, observing the slow nodding, the catching of breath at familiar moments, the quiet tears that spring forth not from melodrama, but recognition. This unscripted feedback, this genuine connection with the source material's audience, is depicted as the ultimate validation. The lights come up, and there is a smattering of applause, sincere and heartfelt. Surya simply nods back, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, already absorbing the lessons from the experience. The ambition now tempered not by compromise, but by profound understanding of the demanding yet necessary act of standing again. The departure from the small cinema marks a subtle pivot, indicating that for Surya, the celebrated completion of one project is merely a necessary prerequisite for confronting the next wave of creative challenges. There is a sense of immediate shedding of the past work. He doesn't linger on accolades or engage in prolonged celebration, a trait that often perplexed his publicists who craved marketable milestones. Instead, the narrative follows him back to a dimly lit, crowded office space, not a lavish production headquarters, but a shared workspace teeming with younger creatives who clearly orbit him, drawn by the gravitational pull of genuine artistic momentum. Here, the environment is chaotically energetic, filled with the overlapping sounds of different languages, the smell of cheap coffee, and the frantic tapping of keyboards. Surya, surprisingly, seems most at ease amidst this productive disarray. He's no longer the isolated auteur wrestling with existential doubt. He's becoming a nexus, a mentor by osmosis. We see him leaning over the shoulder of a very young screenwriter, perhaps working on their first feature script, offering critique that is sharp but always constructive. His advice often circles back to the foundational elements he learned in those early, lean years. Don't write what you think the festival programmers want, he might advise, tracing a line on a cluttered page. Write the geography of your own fear. That geography is universal. This mentorship isn't a calculated career move. It's an act of creative stewardship, ensuring that the authentic voices he fought so hard to amplify are nurtured in others. However, this embrace of the future brings its own form of pressure. The industry, having finally accepted his uncompromising vision, now expects him to replicate the success, perhaps even codify his style. There are meetings with potential international backers who express eager interest in an Indonesian epic, a grander-scale project that seems designed to conquer global markets. These discussions are fraught with unspoken tension. Surya listens patiently, his expression unreadable, nodding at buzzwords like global reach and franchise potential. But the subtle tightening around his jaw betrays his inner resistance. The inspiration for these larger projects is clearly absent. The wellspring that fed his last film, personal history, specific cultural observation, cannot be artificially manufactured for a larger budget. The film hints at the great temptation, taking the easy route of imitation, perhaps directing a slicker version of his own previous work, or tackling a guaranteed commercial success. Yet, a quiet, almost stubborn refusal permeates his decision-making. We see a brief, almost silent scene in his small apartment where he pulls out old, weathered notebooks filled with scribbles and sketches unrelated to his last film, ideas from a decade ago that were deemed too esoteric or unmarketable then. He runs his finger over a particular drawing of an obscure local myth, and a slow smile spreads across his face, suggesting that the true path forward lies not in scaling up what worked, but in returning to the root of genuine, unbidden inspiration. The need to rebuild, to stand again, means choosing the unknown path over the well-trodden one, regardless of the financial scaffolding offered. The true narrative tension shifts from whether he can create art to whether he can refuse the temptation to stop creating true art. This turning point, the conscious rejection of the prepackaged success narrative, solidifies Surya's identity as an artist defined by internal metrics rather than external validation. The decision to pivot back toward the obscure myth, the deeply rooted story that first captivated him, is portrayed almost as a necessary act of self-preservation. We see him actively distancing himself from the polished veneer that success often demands. He starts dressing less conventionally, favoring worn, utilitarian clothing over the sharp attire expected at industry dinners, almost as if trying to visually shed the skin of the critically acclaimed director and return to the guise of the relentless observer. The genesis of this new project centered around the local myth, perhaps one concerning the spiritual landscape of the coastal regions or the forgotten lore of indigenous communities, is slow and deeply immersed in anthropological study. He travels back to the region that inspired the myth, not with a large crew, but often just with Bhima and perhaps one trusted sound recordist. These segments are characterized by quietude and deep listening. We observe Surya sitting for hours with elders, not interviewing them in a formal sense, but participating in their daily rituals, understanding the rhythm of their community before even thinking about framing a shot. This contrasts sharply with the high-stakes, high-pressure environment of his previous production. Here, time is measured not by call sheets, but by tides and the telling of oral histories. The internal conflict this time is subtler but perhaps more profound. The burden of translating sacred or deeply private communal knowledge into a public medium without committing an act of cultural appropriation or exploitation. He wrestles with this ethical tightrope, a far cry from the battles over aspect ratios and color grading of his last feature. In one private conversation captured in a hushed moment near a campfire, he expresses this fear to Bhima. If we take this light, we must ensure we do not cast a shadow where there was none before. The reverence must be louder than the spectacle. This reveals a maturation. His focus has moved from asserting his own vision to safeguarding the vision of the story itself. The casting for this endeavor also reflects this deepening commitment to authenticity. Instead of coaxing raw emotion from established newcomers, Surya seeks individuals who carry the history of the myth in their very presence. People who might not have any formal acting training, but possess an inherent connection to the subject matter. He spends weeks simply building trust, demonstrating respect for their way of life, before even mentioning the possibility of involvement in a film. This painstaking groundwork ensures that when filming finally commences, the energy on set is less about performance and more about ritual enactment, blurring the line between the fictional world and the real community they inhabit. The resulting footage, glimpsed in brief flashes, feels tactile, almost documentary in its immediacy, yet imbued with a spiritual resonance that transcends mere realism, a hallmark of the mature artist finding their most authentic voice through service to the subject. The ensuing production phase for the myth-based project becomes an exercise in deliberate minimalism, a direct aesthetic counterpoint to the scale and commercial expectations that shadowed his previous success. Surya actively eschews digital sleekness, championing the use of older, perhaps even slightly faulty, analog film stock, a decision that introduces a necessary grain and fragility to the visual texture, mirroring the aged quality of the legends he is capturing. This choice, naturally, incenses the modern financiers who linger on the periphery, their anxiety manifesting in terse emails about potential image degradation and archival stability. Worry Surya dismisses with the quiet confidence of someone who understands that imperfection often carries more truth than pristine clarity. His demeanor on this set is remarkably different from the tense focus of his last film. There is a lightness, a sense of joyful rediscovery. He moves among the local community members, the genuine custodians of the lore, with genuine humility. We observe him learning the local dialect not just for dialogue accuracy, but to understand the rhythm of their humor and their grief. This immersion results in moments of unscripted beauty captured by Bhima. Surya laughing genuinely with an elder while discussing a harvest, or the profound silence shared when they witness a specific celestial event that holds significance within the myth. These are not merely filler shots, they are the very architecture of the film's soul. The editing process for this project is characterized by an intense focus on negative space and the power of suggestion. Surya is now less concerned with ensuring the audience understands every narrative beat and more intent on creating an emotional and spiritual resonance that bypasses intellectual analysis. He spends time studying classical Indonesian shadow puppetry, the way light and shadow shape meaning without fully revealing the form. This translates into sequences where crucial events are implied rather than shown directly, trusting the audience's capacity for engagement and interpretation, a direct challenge to the current trend of cinematic over-explanation. He works with the editor not to speed things up, but to find the perfect duration for silence, allowing the ambient sounds of the natural world, the wind through the tall grasses, the distant sound of the ocean, to carry narrative weight. When the film is finally previewed for a small, trusted circle, perhaps only his oldest collaborators and a few respected academics familiar with the specific cultural context, the reaction is visceral rather than critical. There's a shared sense of having witnessed something sacred being treated with proper gravity. The affirmation Surya seeks comes not from a standing ovation, but from the quiet, reverent exhale of those who recognize their own heritage reflected truthfully on screen. It is the feeling of having successfully guarded a fragile treasure during its journey into the light. The film doesn't promise immediate box office glory, nor does it court the predictable controversies of his earlier work. Instead, it establishes a new standard for Surya, the commitment to an art so specific, so rooted, that its success is measured purely by its resonance within the community it honors, securing his legacy not as a director who achieved fame, but as a filmmaker who achieved fidelity. The quiet acknowledgement from the inner circle settles upon Surya not as a final destination, but as a temporary mooring. The weight of having honored a sacred narrative lends him a strange, almost buoyant energy as he begins the next phase, integration. With the film now complete, the necessary, yet always unpleasant, task of presenting it to the wider world looms. This time, however, the strategy is markedly different. Instead of immediately submitting to the major international festivals where the commercial machinery whirs loudest, Surya and Bima make a conscious decision to premiere the film in smaller regional showcases across Indonesia, prioritizing access for the very communities whose stories are interwoven into the celluloid. The initial screenings become less about film critique and more about communal witnessing. In remote villages, far from Jakarta's critical echo chamber, the response is immediate and deeply emotional. We see scenes of Surya sitting in the audience, now comfortably enveloped by the very people who shared their lore with him, observing how the projected image interacts with their lived reality. If the previous film was about building a bridge to a general audience, this one is about reinforcing the foundation within its source community. There are moments captured where audience members point at the screen, recognizing a specific gesture, a particular piece of architecture, a shared memory, confirming that the translation, however ethically fraught, has succeeded in maintaining fidelity. This grassroots success begins to generate a different kind of buzz, one that bypasses the usual industry gatekeepers. It's a word-of-mouth phenomenon driven by cultural pride rather than marketing spend. When the film finally does enter the larger festival circuit later, its power is amplified by this pre-existing reverence. Critics who once dismissed his earlier work as perhaps too localized now struggle to categorize this new offering. It possesses an undeniable spiritual gravity that mere technique cannot replicate. They are forced to confront a cinema that refuses to conform to Western narrative expectations, operating instead on a rhythm dictated by tradition. Surya, navigating this renewed attention, seems paradoxically less visible. He delegates much of the press engagement to a trusted young publicist, one of the creatives from his shared office space, allowing himself the necessary solitude to process the impact. His most revealing public appearances now are not formal Q&A sessions, but impromptu gatherings where he discusses the craft of observation itself. He speaks less about directing and more about listening, about the responsibility of the storyteller to be a conduit rather than an originator. He often cites the lesson he learned from the elder storytellers. The story was already complete. My job was only to ensure the silence around it was appropriate. The final reflection offered by the film is cyclical and profound. Having navigated the temptation of commercial replication and chosen the harder path of rooted authenticity, Surya returns to his studio, not to immediately begin shooting the next grand project, but to organize the archives. We see him cataloging not just his own footage, but the raw, unedited interviews, the sketches, the historical photographs he gathered over the years. This act of curating his own creative history suggests a shift in ambition, from constantly producing to meticulously preserving. The film closes with Surya in the editing suite once more, but this time he is not cutting a feature. He is assembling a small, silent montage composed entirely of the genuine smiles and quiet acknowledgments from the community screenings. It is an intimate testament to the idea that standing again is not about climbing higher, but about digging deeper, finding immovable ground in shared cultural memory. The scene of Surya organizing his archives feels less like a conclusion and more like the quiet preparation for a necessary descent back into the wellspring of inspiration. The physical act of handling the physical artifacts, the brittle negatives, the annotated field journals, the cassette tapes holding untranscribed oral histories, seems to ground him, anchoring the ephemeral nature of filmmaking to tangible reality. This process of archival curation speaks volumes about his evolving philosophy, that the value of a work lies not solely in its public screening, but in the integrity of the research and the ethical relationship maintained with the source material. He treats the documentation of the Myth Project with the same meticulous care he once reserved for framing a perfect shot, recognizing that the context surrounding the art is often as vital as the art itself. This focus on preservation also allows him to mentor in a new, less intrusive way. The younger creatives, initially drawn by the promise of being associated with a successful director, now witness the deep, often tedious work of historical stewardship. They see that the revolutionary act isn't always the new creation, but the careful safeguarding of inherited cultural narratives. Surya doesn't lecture them on preservation. He simply includes them in the methodical process of cataloging, handing them old photographic prints and asking for their impressions, thereby weaving them into the lineage of caretaking. This mentorship, devoid of the immediate pressure of deadlines, fosters a more resilient form of artistic integrity among his protégés. Meanwhile, the external world continues its relentless pursuit of the next marketable product. There are brief, almost comical intrusions from agents and distributors eager to leverage the critical success of the Myth film into a more accessible television series or a digitally remastered special edition. Surya handles these overtures with a weary patience that suggests he has long ago made peace with the impossibility of satisfying the market's appetite for endless consumption of the same thing. His refusal is unspoken but absolute, illustrated by a moment where he gently declines a lucrative offer to consult on a historical documentary series, stating simply that he has no more time to lend his name to anything that doesn't require his direct, uncompromised presence in the field. The narrative subtly reveals that Surya's true inheritance is not from the cinematic masters he admired in his youth, but from the community elders who taught him the value of patience and cyclical storytelling. He starts incorporating elements of their rhythmic philosophy into his own life. The intensity that once burned him out now flickers with a steadier, sustainable flame. He begins to reclaim personal time, marked by small, deliberate acts, tending to a small garden outside his modest residence, or taking long solitary walks without any recording equipment. These moments are essential breathing spaces, allowing the creative mind to refill the reservoir tapped by the previous intense endeavor. The film ultimately suggests that Surya has achieved a rare form of artistic survival. He has managed to remain relevant without becoming commercialized and profound without becoming inaccessible. The very structure of the story implies that his greatest achievement is not the film itself, but the cultivation of an internal landscape resilient enough to weather the demands of recognition. The closing sequence doesn't show him on a glamorous set or accepting an award. Instead, it shows him back in the quiet regional cinema where he first tested his film, this time sitting unobtrusively in the back row, watching a completely different, independent local film, one clearly made by one of his mentored young filmmakers. He is observing their nascent struggles, their own moments of doubt and eventual triumph, with an expression of deep, quiet satisfaction. He has not just stood up again. He has built a platform from which others can begin their own arduous, necessary ascent. This final image of Surya seated in the shadows, witnessing the blossoming of another artist's vision, completes a significant arc, moving him from the self-consuming pursuit of personal expression to the quiet fulfillment of fostering a creative ecosystem. His presence in that small cinema is a testament to his understanding that true artistic contribution transcends the singular masterpiece. It lies in ensuring the continuity of authentic storytelling. The young filmmaker whose work he is observing, perhaps showing the same early stylistic tics Surya himself once exhibited, is afforded the luxury of a slightly smoother initial ascent, shielded by the institutional respect Surya has painstakingly built. Surya's ongoing engagement with the archival work also takes on a new dimension. It is no longer just about documenting the past. It becomes a form of subtle, ongoing collaboration with the future. He begins digitizing and annotating key historical documents and early film excerpts, creating a curated digital library accessible to film schools and independent artists, a library deliberately devoid of heavy theoretical overlays, presented simply as raw material for inspiration, much like the archives he used to sneak into as a hungry student. This initiative is an act of defiance against the industry trend of hoarding resources. Surya is democratizing the very foundations that allowed him to find his voice. The industry, having tried and failed to mold him into a predictable blockbuster director, now attempts a different approach: veneration. He is invited to give the keynote address at a major national film conference. We see the preparation for this speech, not agonizing over rhetorical flourishes, but painstakingly crafting a narrative that redirects the spotlight away from his own achievements. His address, delivered with uncharacteristic warmth, focuses almost entirely on the unheralded artisans of cinema, the dedicated sound mixers, the patient costume designers, the community liaisons, those whose tireless work often goes uncredited in the hierarchy of auteur worship. He uses his platform not to celebrate his standing again, but to elevate those who provide the necessary ground beneath everyone's feet. The film subtly suggests that the greatest reward for surviving the creative crucible is the ability to grant grace, both to others and to his former self. There are fleeting, almost dreamlike sequences where we see the younger, more arrogant Surya, the one who fought so fiercely for every frame, softened by the perspective gained. He revisits the locations from his earliest, near-failed projects, not with regret, but with a sense of gratitude for the struggles that forged his resilience. He understands now that the early rejections were not roadblocks, but necessary calibrations, preventing him from peaking too soon or with the wrong kind of material. In the final moments, we see Surya receiving a small, hand-carved wooden object from one of the village elders from his last project, a token representing acceptance and integration into their cultural space. It's an object with no monetary or critical value, yet he places it prominently on his otherwise sparse desk, a silent counterweight to any potential trophies. The narrative closes not on an announcement of his next project, but on a sustained shot of him looking out of his window, the city lights twinkling below, a familiar landscape, yet viewed through newly clarified eyes. The journey to Stand Again was never about reaching a summit, but about establishing a sustainable, ethical rhythm of engagement, ensuring that the act of creation remains an act of service, not just self-expression. The quiet authority Surya now commands is subtly manifested in his engagement with Bhima, the long-suffering cinematographer. Their interactions have evolved beyond the professional. They now share a language of knowing glances, forged in the crucible of shared creative near-disaster. When they review early footage from the Myth Project, the deliberately grainy, ethically sourced material, there's a quiet acknowledgement of the risk they undertook. Bhima, whose own career has been marked by spectacular but commercially fleeting visual achievements, finds a stable anchor in Surya's principled approach. He often remarks, half-jokingly, that working with Surya is like constantly arguing with a very stubborn poet who happens to have a camera. Every choice must be defended not on technical grounds, but on philosophical ones. This commitment to ethical process means that when Surya finally does commit to a new, substantial project, the financing is structured entirely on his terms, a hard-won concession from cautious but newly respectful investors. This new endeavor appears to be a departure, a period piece set during a tumultuous era of Indonesian political history, a subject fraught with the potential for controversy and the necessity for rigorous historical accuracy. It suggests Surya is moving beyond the intimate, spiritual landscape of the previous film and engaging with the complex tapestry of national memory, a challenge requiring an even deeper level of scholarly immersion. The preparation for this historical piece involves Surya diving headfirst into primary documents, moving beyond oral tradition to the tangible evidence of the past. We see him visiting museum curators and historians, his usual directorial impatience completely absent, replaced by the focused intensity of a scholar. He insists on absolute fidelity to the period details, commissioning artisans to recreate specific textiles and furniture, not for superficial accuracy, but because he believes the weight and texture of an object influence the performance and the very atmosphere of a scene. This meticulousness stems from his early viewing of classic Indonesian cinema, where the tangible setting often felt like an additional, silent character. The casting process for this historical drama introduces a new tension, balancing authenticity with the necessary demands of performance craft. Surya finds himself having to choose between actors with genuine regional ties to the historical events and seasoned performers capable of carrying the emotional weight of intense dramatic scenes. He resolves this by creating hybrid roles, pairing a highly respected, established actor with an unheralded community member in key scenes, allowing the raw, lived connection of the latter to subtly inform the performance of the former. It's a directorial tightrope walk, ensuring the drama resonates emotionally without sacrificing historical reverence. As production commences, the atmosphere is tightly controlled, a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the Myth Project. Here, the control is necessary to navigate the politically sensitive nature of the material. Surya remains utterly calm under the pressure of external scrutiny, his silence in meetings more potent than any argument. He teaches his cast and crew a simple mantra derived from his archival work. The truth does not need to be loud to be undeniable. This steady, unwavering direction, built on a foundation of exhaustive preparation, ensures that when controversial or emotionally charged scenes are shot, The resulting takes possess an inherent gravity that cannot be faked, cementing Surya's reputation as an artist who demands rigor in service of profound, difficult truths. The development of this historical piece brings Surya into direct, if often mediated, confrontation with the structures of power that influenced his early career. The political sensitivity of the subject matter necessitates approvals and clearances that were thankfully absent when he was making his fiercely independent shorts. We see subtle power plays during production meetings, where government liaisons attempt to steer dialogue or censor specific visual representations of historical events. Surya's resistance is never explosive. It is a slow, grinding assertion of artistic autonomy, often relying on the undeniable weight of his carefully vetted historical research to parry suggestions for alteration. He argues not from personal opinion, but from documented fact, making it exceedingly difficult for external pressures to find purchase against his meticulously constructed narrative. His personal investment in this period is revealed through a brief, poignant flashback showing his own family's connection, perhaps indirect, to the historical turmoil he is depicting. This history informs his performance notes. He doesn't just tell an actor what the character feels, but why that feeling is imprinted in the national psyche. This deep personal rooting allows him to push his seasoned actors to expose layers of historical trauma they might have otherwise kept guarded, transforming their performances from technical excellence into genuine excavation. The lead actor, known for their polished stage presence, is shown struggling during a difficult scene, finally breaking down after Surya shares a fragment of a personal family story related to that specific historical trauma, dissolving the barrier between performance and lived experience. Bhima, ever the pragmatist, plays a crucial role in shielding the set from bureaucratic interference. While Surya engages with the ethical and thematic complexities, Bhima masterfully handles the visual documentation process, ensuring that every shot is logged and justified against historical evidence, creating an unimpeachable paper trail that thwarts potential censorship attempts after the fact. Their collaboration is a perfect synergy. Surya provides the moral and thematic compass, while Bhima ensures the logistical and visual integrity remains airtight. As the final cut nears completion, the editing process reflects the film's heavier subject matter. It is less about finding rhythm and more about managing immense weight. Surya is ruthless in excising anything that feels sensationalized or purely for dramatic effect, understanding that in portraying national trauma, restraint is the highest form of respect. He works late nights, bathed in the cold light of the monitors, looking older, the fatigue around his eyes more pronounced, suggesting that engaging with history demands a different kind of sacrifice than purely fictional creation. The premiere of the historical film is markedly different from his previous endeavors. It's a serious, almost somber affair, attended by historians, surviving figures from the era depicted, and serious critics. The applause, when it comes, is less ecstatic and more a heavy, sustained acknowledgement of a difficult but necessary truth having been faced on screen. There is a visible catharsis in the audience, a sense that a long overdue conversation has finally been facilitated by the art. For Surya, the relief is quiet, internalized. He steps onto the stage not to accept praise, but to humbly thank the historical consultants and the surviving members of the community who lent their memory to the project. The narrative concludes not with him planning his next move, but with him observing the quiet, respectful dispersal of the audience, satisfied that he has not just told a story, but helped reconcile a piece of the past, reaffirming that for him, the ability to stand again is always predicated on the willingness to carry the weight of history. The cinematic offering, titled Nonton Kembali Berdiri presents a compelling, if somewhat conventional, narrative centered around themes of resilience, personal reinvention, and the often unseen sacrifices inherent in achieving public adoration. The core of the film orbits the journey of its protagonist, whose trajectory mirrors many real-life stories of performers navigating the often brutal landscape of the entertainment industry. The initial portrayal of the main character emphasizes a period of burgeoning talent juxtaposed with profound vulnerability. This mirrors the early struggles often seen in biographies of celebrated Indonesian musicians or actors, where raw, unrefined skill must contend with systemic gatekeeping. We see glimpses of the protagonist's formative years, perhaps drawing inspiration from figures like Iwan Fals, in terms of socio-political commentary woven subtly into early compositions, or perhaps the disciplined, rigorous training associated with established actors from the Teeter Coma School of Performance, emphasizing physical and emotional commitment. The film excels in depicting the crushing weight of expectation following initial success. This is where the analysis of the protagonist's career arc becomes crucial. Early fame often necessitates a retreat from genuine self-expression in favor of marketability. The visual language employed during the protagonist's peak period often utilizes stark contrasts, dazzling stage lights illuminating a face that betrays deep internal fatigue. This resonates with the known struggles of actors like Reza Rahadian, whose capacity for transformative roles belies the immense emotional toll those transformations exact during production schedules. The director seems keenly aware of this dichotomy, using tight close-ups during moments of public performance to capture the performative nature of happiness. The inevitable downturn or crisis, the central pivot of Kembali Berdiri, meaning to stand up again, is handled with deliberate pacing. This segment of the film moves away from the gloss of celebrity and grounds itself in the mundane reality of loss or failure. Whether this failure stems from a critical flop, a personal scandal, or simply creative exhaustion, the script smartly avoids melodrama, opting instead for quiet introspection. The depiction of the protagonist's isolation might subtly evoke the solitary nature of a director like Rano Karno, who has successfully transitioned between acting, directing, and producing, suggesting that true artistic longevity often requires periods of deliberate stepping away from the spotlight to re-evaluate foundational principles. The process of standing up again is not portrayed as a sudden, miraculous recovery, but as a slow, painstaking reconstruction of self-worth independent of external validation. The film wisely incorporates mentorship, perhaps embodied by an older, retired figure whose wisdom stems from a different era of Indonesian artistic endeavor, a character whose quiet dignity recalls the influence of veteran film critics or producers who value substance over fleeting trends. This relationship facilitates the protagonist's rediscovery of their initial artistic impulse. Technically, the film's cinematography during the comeback phase shifts to warmer, more natural lighting, suggesting a return to authenticity. The musical score, if present, would likely shift from bombastic orchestral arrangements to more intimate, acoustic instrumentation, reinforcing the internal focus of the character's renewed commitment. The ultimate message gleaned is that true professional and personal resurrection is less about reclaiming past glory and more about forging a new, honest relationship with one's craft, a sentiment deeply embedded in the narrative of many enduring artists whose careers span decades of shifting cultural tides. The film functions as a testament to the enduring human need to create, even when the applause fades. The emotional core of Nonton Kembali Berdiri resides in the portrayal of the protagonist's internal monologue during their nadir. This is where the script moves beyond industry critique and delves into universal human experience. We are shown glimpses of the protagonist's relationship with their art, not as a job, but as an intrinsic part of their being, now seemingly corrupted by commercial demands. Consider the texture of their isolation. It is not just loneliness, but the specific alienation felt by someone whose public persona has entirely overshadowed their private self. The scenes depicting this low point often utilize cramped, dimly lit spaces, perhaps a stark contrast to the sprawling, brightly lit sound stages or concert venues of their past, visually reinforcing the shrinking world of the fallen star. The character development benefits significantly from exploring the relationships that either enabled the fall or facilitated the rise. If the protagonist is an actor, we might examine the influence of a demanding auteur-director, perhaps one whose artistic vision bordered on tyrannical, but whose work undeniably elevated the performer's craft, a dynamic akin to the intense, though sometimes fraught, collaborations seen in the making of acclaimed Indonesian historical epics. Conversely, the return journey often necessitates severing ties with enablers, perhaps slick managers or superficial associates whose loyalty was purely transactional. This act of pruning the professional ecosystem is frequently more painful than facing the public critics, as it requires acknowledging one's own complicity in past excesses. The moments leading up to the final standing up are often characterized by small, almost accidental rediscoveries. Perhaps the protagonist stumbles upon an old, dog-eared script or an early unpolished demo tape. This catalyst isn't a grand revelation, but a quiet acknowledgement of the joy that preceded the ambition. This echoes the spirit of artists who deliberately step away from mainstream projects to engage in independent or passion projects, a route often taken by established Indonesian filmmakers seeking creative autonomy away from studio constraints. The emotion conveyed here is relief, the feeling of having located the original source code of one's drive. Furthermore, the film subtly addresses the societal expectation placed upon figures of inspiration. For someone who has publicly embodied strength or artistic perfection, the visible act of faltering carries an added weight of perceived betrayal to their fanbase. The protagonist's anxiety in the comeback phase is therefore twofold: fear of professional failure and fear of confirming the audience's suspicion that their earlier success was a facade. The audience reaction shots during the initial tentative return performance are crucial here. They must betray confusion, skepticism, and finally, a gradual thawing as they recognize the genuine emotion radiating from the performer once more. This emotional transaction between stage and audience forms the climax, demonstrating that authenticity, however late, is the ultimate currency in enduring fame. The final image should not be one of triumphant exhaustion, but of quiet integration, the celebrity and the person finally occupying the same space. The lingering emotional resonance of Nonton Kembali Berdiri stems from the film's unflinching portrayal of the protagonist's confrontation with their own legacy. It is not enough to merely return to work. The character must reconcile the public mythology they unknowingly helped construct with the flawed, human reality they now inhabit. This internal negotiation is often externalized through nuanced physical performance. During the recovery phase, the protagonist's movements might be tentative, lacking the confident swagger of their earlier years. There is a vulnerability in their posture, a self-consciousness that suggests they are acutely aware of every eye watching, judging whether the real person is worthy of the adoration previously reserved for the persona. This physical storytelling is reminiscent of the nuanced physical transformation an actor like Nicholas Saputra might undertake, conveying deep internal struggle through subtle shifts in bearing rather than overt dramatic displays. The dynamic with the supporting cast, particularly those who represent the old life, becomes a rich source of emotional tension. One might see the protagonist encountering a former collaborator, perhaps a songwriter or a co-star, who represents the height of their past success, but now views the protagonist with pity or condescension. These exchanges are weighted not by overt conflict, but by unspoken history and divergent paths. The protagonist's reaction to this pity, often a quiet withdrawal or a forced smile masking deep hurt, reveals how deeply success can alter interpersonal perceptions. They are mourning not just their career, but the quality of the relationships that fame had either insulated or poisoned. Moreover, the film touches upon the protagonist's relationship with time itself. For someone whose career was defined by peak moments, a hit album launch, a major award win, the slow passage of time during their hiatus must feel like a form of existential erasure. The audience glimpses moments where the protagonist passively observes younger talents succeeding, an experience that breeds a complex mix of nostalgia, professional envy, and eventual acceptance. This contemplation of mortality in a field obsessed with youth is often handled through quiet montage sequences, old photographs, fading posters, set to music that is deliberately subdued, signifying a release from the frantic need to constantly be relevant. The final act of standing up is therefore less a grand performance and more an act of quiet self-possession. It's the decision to embrace imperfection as a part of the ongoing artistic statement. When the protagonist finally takes the stage or steps onto the set for the comeback project, the emotion conveyed is not overwhelming joy, but a grounded sense of peace. They are no longer performing for an audience or against their past, they are simply being. This subtle shift transforms the climax from a conventional victory lap into a profound meditation on enduring artistry, suggesting that true standing up involves accepting the possibility of falling again, but with the wisdom gained from having done it once before. The enduring power of the film lies in making this internal victory legible and deeply relatable to anyone who has ever had to redefine themselves after a significant loss. The narrative subtly explores the concept of inherited artistic pressure, particularly if the protagonist has any connection to a legacy within the Indonesian creative sphere. Should the character be the child of a celebrated musician, dancer, or director, a common trope in cultures that highly value familial contribution to the arts, the struggle gains an additional layer of complexity. The initial success might have been viewed as the fulfillment of an expectation, making the subsequent failure feel like a betrayal not just of the public, but of one's lineage. The film could utilize flashbacks depicting the intense pride or perhaps the overwhelming scrutiny placed upon the protagonist by a successful parent figure, perhaps mirroring the high standards often set by established figures in regional cinema who see their work as cultural custodianship. This inherited burden colors the recovery process significantly. Rebuilding is not just about personal affirmation. It involves carving out an identity separate from the shadow of a predecessor. The protagonist might actively seek out roles or musical styles that are diametrically opposed to their lineage's known work, a subconscious rebellion against the blueprint laid out for them. The emotional weight here is the realization that true respect, even from one's own family, must be earned anew, stripped of the advantages of a famous name. The film might use visual metaphors, such as the protagonist refusing to use their ancestral home or studio during their low point, opting instead for a Spartan, self-funded space, symbolizing a commitment to building a foundation entirely on their own terms. Furthermore, The theme of audience forgiveness versus artistic integrity is continuously tested in the comeback arc. The public, having invested emotionally in the fallen idol, often demands a return to the comfortable, familiar style that first endeared them. The protagonist's ultimate test isn't simply being able to perform, but having the courage to present work that is potentially less immediately palatable, but more artistically honest. If the comeback involves a shift in genre, say, a pop star moving toward traditional gamelan-infused compositions, or an actor choosing a challenging, character-driven indie role over a blockbuster, the initial audience response might be confusion or even hostility. This tension between the artist's evolution and the audience's nostalgia is portrayed with palpable anxiety. The success of Kembali Berdiri hinges on the audience ultimately choosing to follow the artist's growth rather than demand their regression, acknowledging that true longevity requires continuous metamorphosis, much like the ever-evolving landscape of contemporary Indonesian film distribution adapting to streaming platforms. The narrative's exploration of artistic evolution inevitably intersects with the protagonist's confrontation of their past collaborators who have moved on, perhaps even surpassed them, during the hiatus. These encounters are crucial in framing the protagonist's perception of time's relentless march. Imagine a scene where the protagonist runs into a former bandmate, now a highly successful solo producer, leading a new generation of artists. The interaction would be laced with forced pleasantries. The producer, perhaps offering hollow encouragement rooted in pity for the protagonist's perceived stagnation. This forces the protagonist to recognize that the industry does not pause for personal crises. Relevance is a constantly renewing contract. The emotion here is a sharp, bitter envy, tempered by the dawning understanding that envy is wasted energy. The internal work required for the protagonist to shed the need for external validation is visualized through their approach to rehearsal or creative development. Gone are the days of demanding entourages and extravagant demands. Instead, we see meticulous, almost obsessive attention to foundational technique. Perhaps the protagonist spends hours alone with a specific instrument or practices scenes in front of a bare mirror, stripping away the theatricality until only the core competency remains. This focus mirrors the dedication required of disciplined martial artists or classical dancers who must constantly return to basic forms to maintain mastery, suggesting that true resurgence is rooted in discipline rather than inspiration. The role of the new creative team surrounding the protagonist in the comeback phase is significant. They must represent a complete philosophical break from the old guard. These newcomers are unburdened by the protagonist's mythology. They view the character as a blank canvas of potential rather than a museum piece of past hits. Their dialogue would be direct, challenging, and focused purely on the current material. This environment fosters a sense of earned trust, where the protagonist has to reprove their worth based on daily output, not past accolades. This mirrors the invigorating effect that collaborating with fresh, globally aware talent often has on established Indonesian cinema figures looking to inject contemporary urgency into their work. Finally, the film must address the lingering psychological scar tissue associated with public failure. Even after achieving success in the comeback, the protagonist is likely to exhibit moments of hyper-vigilance, flinching at unexpected loud noises, double-checking reviews obsessively, or displaying an almost paralyzing fear before stepping onto a small, unfamiliar stage. This isn't weakness, but a realistic depiction of trauma resilience. The resolution isn't forgetting the fall, but integrating it as part of the cautionary wisdom that now informs their art, making their current work richer, more textured, and undeniably authentic. The final image should capture this integration, the protagonist achieving a moment of pure, unselfconscious creation, a quiet triumph over the specter of their own past vulnerability. The final stages of the protagonist's recovery necessitate an open acknowledgement of the assistance received, a moment often fraught with complex emotions for a fiercely independent spirit. True humility, in the context of celebrity rehabilitation, is not simply admitting fault, but actively crediting those who offered a lifeline without seeking a piece of the subsequent glory. This is where the relationship with the quiet mentor figure, previously introduced, solidifies into a bond of genuine mutual respect. The protagonist might formally introduce this mentor to the new, younger creative team, effectively bridging the gap between the wisdom of experience and the energy of the new movement. This act signifies a conscious decision to move past the ego that demanded self-sufficiency during the downfall. Emotionally, this phase is characterized by a tentative re-engagement with the wider world outside the immediate artistic circle. The protagonist might finally allow themselves to experience simple pleasures, a quiet walk in a public park, enjoying a local street food vendor, moments that were impossible during the suffocating bubble of peak fame. These scenes are often shot with handheld cameras and natural lighting, emphasizing immediacy and unscripted reality, contrasting sharply with the calculated framing of their earlier public appearances. This gentle reintegration showcases that standing up again means learning how to simply exist in the world without the armor of celebrity expectations. The film could benefit from a brief yet poignant scene where the protagonist revisits a location central to their early inspiration, or perhaps their greatest professional shame. A specific theater, a recording studio, or even the site of a crucial childhood memory. In this location, the internal conflict resolves not through a dramatic outburst, but through a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in expression, a softening of the jawline, a release of held breath. This visual cue indicates that the character has made peace with the geography of their own history, understanding that the past cannot be erased, only assimilated. Moreover, the commentary on the protagonist's creative output needs a final definition. The new work emerging from this period should possess a quality of hard-won clarity. If the protagonist was known for overtly emotional or technically complex pieces, the comeback material might favor stark simplicity and thematic depth. It reflects an understanding that true communication requires cutting away ornamentation. This artistic choice serves as the ultimate proof of their transformation. They are no longer striving to impress, but striving to connect. This final artistic statement solidifies the message that the resilience celebrated in Kembali Berdiri is not just about surviving setbacks, but about using those very cracks in one's foundation to let a more genuine light shine through. The character achieves a state of artistic grace earned through genuine struggle rather than bestowed by fortune. The film culminates not in a massive stadium-filling concert or an awards acceptance speech, but in a scene of quiet, focused creation, suggesting the true victory lies internally. Picture the protagonist, perhaps late in the evening, seated at a simple workstation, illuminated only by the glow of a monitor or a single desk lamp. They are deeply immersed in their work, composing, writing, or reviewing footage. And for the first time in the entire narrative, the tension is absent from their physical presence. Their shoulders are relaxed, their breathing steady. This is the visual embodiment of having finally synchronized their internal state with their external activity. This final immersion underscores a crucial character shift. The protagonist has moved from seeking validation through performance to finding fulfillment through process. The emotional backdrop is one of grounded contentment, far removed from the manic highs and lows of earlier success. The character's eyes, which in earlier segments held either the desperate glaze of ambition or the deadness of exhaustion, now possess a focused, calm intensity. This suggests an alignment with artists who, having achieved mainstream success, choose to prioritize artistic integrity over commercial longevity, perhaps echoing the deliberate career choices of figures who retreated from Hollywood's demands to pursue meaningful, smaller-scale projects. The narrative cleverly avoids offering a definitive happily ever after regarding fame. Instead, the final moments hint at the ongoing, cyclical nature of artistic life. There might be a subtle suggestion of a new challenge on the horizon, a script lying open, a blank score sheet, but the protagonist approaches it without fear or overexcitement. They are prepared for the next phase, whatever it may be, because the foundation is now built on self-knowledge rather than external perception. This acceptance of uncertainty is the final, most mature form of resilience the film champions. The audience understands that this person can fall again, but critically, they now possess the internal mechanism to rise, not just through sheer will, but through genuine self-awareness forged in the crucible of public failure. The lingering feeling is one of earned peace, a profound testament to the arduous journey of reclaiming one's authentic self within the unrelenting glare of the public eye. The subtle yet profound impact of the protagonist's journey on their immediate environment and those closest to them forms the undercurrent of the film's final movement. While the central arc focuses on personal resurrection, the periphery reveals the collateral damage and subsequent healing within their private relationships. If the protagonist had a spouse or a long-suffering family member, these secondary characters, often rendered peripheral during the height of fame and then burdened during the fall, finally begin to recalibrate their own lives in relation to the new person emerging. Their emotional landscape shifts from one of cautious expectation to tentative hope, often manifested in small gestures of normalcy, a shared, unforced meal, a spontaneous laugh, that were conspicuously absent during the celebrated years. The film might dedicate a brief sequence to the protagonist interacting with a child or younger relative, serving as a mirror to their past self or a barometer for their future impact. This interaction is characterized by an honesty untainted by the protagonist's professional anxieties. Seeing the world through the eyes of someone unconcerned with box office returns or critical reviews allows the protagonist a moment of pure, unmediated connection, reinforcing that their intrinsic value extends far beyond their public metrics. This moment serves as a quiet affirmation that the discipline and introspection undertaken during their isolation have resulted in a better human being, not just a better artist, a critical distinction for a narrative centered on genuine, standing up. Furthermore, the film touches upon the protagonist's active role in reshaping their public narrative, moving beyond merely enduring scrutiny to deliberately crafting their legacy on their own terms. This might involve a carefully considered interview or public statement where they address their past failures directly, not with self-pity, but with analytical detachment, framing the mistakes as necessary tuition fees for artistic maturity. This final act of narrative control is a profound display of power. They are no longer subject to gossip columns or speculative critiques, but are instead framing the context for their own continued relevance. This mirrors the strategic public positioning often employed by legacy artists who understand that managing perception is as vital as maintaining craft quality in the digital age. The message conveyed is that true freedom from the machinery of fame comes when one dictates the terms of engagement, turning past vulnerability into current strength. The final lingering question the film addresses, though never overtly stated, is the protagonist's relationship with the very idea of legacy once the immediate crisis has passed. In the Indonesian context, where artistic contributions are often interwoven with national identity and cultural memory, the pressure to leave an indelible, flawless mark is immense. Having navigated the near destruction of that potential legacy, the protagonist must now confront what lasting impact truly means. Is it the number of awards, the enduring popularity of early hits, or something more intangible? The answer the film seems to propose lies in the influence the protagonist begins to exert on the next wave of emerging talent. Instead of hoarding knowledge or maintaining an aura of untouchable seniority, the rehabilitated figure becomes an accessible, pragmatic source of guidance. This is not the formal mentorship of the earlier phase, but a casual, almost accidental impartation of hard-won wisdom, a warning against the pitfalls of rapid commercialization, a gentle reminder to prioritize authentic voice over trend chasing. We see this visualized through the protagonist being sought out, not for grand pronouncements, but for quiet counsel in rehearsal rooms or late-night studio sessions with younger artists who recognize the authenticity born from suffering. Emotionally, this transition from recipient of help to giver of wisdom marks the final stage of emotional integration. The protagonist stops measuring their present success against their past peak or the success of their peers, and starts measuring it by the positive ripple effect they create. There is a distinct lack of bitterness in these interactions. Instead, there is a quiet satisfaction in seeing genuine talent nurtured without the toxic scaffolding that nearly destroyed their own career. This echoes the satisfaction seen in established Indonesian auteurs who transition to teaching roles, finding new purpose in cultivating the national artistic future rather than constantly competing in the present market. The film's closing visual should encapsulate this layered achievement. It might show the protagonist looking out over a bustling city landscape, a symbol of the world they once tried to conquer and then fled, but now viewing it with detached affection rather than ownership or fear. The focus is no longer internal anxiety or external performance, but a quiet appreciation for the continuous cycle of creation and reinvention. Nonton Kembali Berdiri ultimately suggests that standing up is not a singular event, but the ongoing, deliberate choice to remain engaged with one's craft, bearing the scars of the past as necessary texture, not as handicaps. The true victory is the capacity to keep showing up authentically, day after day. The final thematic layer that deepens the resonance of Nonton Kembali Berdiri concerns the protagonist's evolving relationship with their own physical presence and aging, particularly poignant in an industry obsessed with manufactured youth. As the narrative concludes, the character is no longer attempting to recapture the flawless image of their early 20s. Instead, the subtle introduction of the realities of time, perhaps a slight hesitation before a difficult physical stunt, or the acceptance of using subtle lighting to complement, rather than mask, the passage of years, becomes a powerful statement of artistic maturation. This acceptance stands in stark contrast to the relentless pursuit of an impossible standard that fueled their initial burnout. This confrontation with physicality is often reflected in their choice of material for the comeback. If the protagonist is an actor, they might deliberately seek roles that require gravitas, nuance, or even vulnerability associated with maturity. Steering clear of roles demanding the youthful energy they can no longer convincingly project without artifice. If a musician, their performance style might shift from frantic, athletic stage shows to a more grounded presence, where the connection is forged through vocal storytelling and emotional depth rather than sheer kinetic output. This conscious recalibration demonstrates that the protagonist has internalized the lesson that authenticity includes acknowledging temporal limitations. Emotionally, this acceptance brings about a serene form of professional liberation. The constant internal battle against inevitable decline ceases, freeing up immense psychic energy previously devoted to vanity and maintenance. This liberation allows for a purer focus on the artistic task at hand. The film might convey this through a final, extended take of the protagonist engaged in their craft, perhaps singing a new song or delivering a crucial monologue, where the camera lingers just long enough for the audience to observe a genuine smile, one that reaches the eyes and reflects inner peace rather than external triumph. This quiet contentment implies that the greatest performance is the one they give to themselves, regardless of public reception. Furthermore, the film subtly critiques the commodification of vulnerability itself. Having gone through a highly publicized fall and recovery, the protagonist must be extremely guarded against turning their past trauma into marketable content for the next project. The final test is resisting the urge to exploit their own pain for commercial gain. Their silence on certain painful details, or their refusal to participate in tell-all documentaries, signals a boundary established not out of arrogance, but out of a commitment to self-preservation. This nuanced restraint suggests that true professional survival involves knowing which parts of the self must remain sacred and protected from the voracious appetite of public consumption, completing the arc from being consumed by the spotlight to commanding its boundaries. The ultimate triumph of Nonton Kembali Berdiri is perhaps located in the protagonist's redefined relationship with silence and downtime. During the initial ascent, every moment not spent actively producing or promoting was perceived as a vacuum to be filled, a threat to momentum. Downtime was an inefficiency. During the nadir, silence was deafening, filled with internal accusations and regret. However, in the final resolution, silence is reclaimed as a necessary creative resource. We might witness the protagonist deliberately choosing long periods of non-activity, not out of depression, but out of strategic necessity. This intentional emptiness creates the space for new ideas to germinate, free from the incessant noise of expectation and comparison. The visual language here might utilize long, static shots of the protagonist observing nature, or simply sitting quietly, allowing the audience to breathe along with them. This echoes the meditative practices often adopted by artists who seek profound internal clarity, perhaps drawing parallels with spiritual or philosophical retreats undertaken by mature creatives looking to strip away the artifice of their public lives. This newfound appreciation for quietude translates directly into their work ethic. There is a measurable decrease in frantic energy and an increase in deliberate pacing. Deadlines are still met, but the process is no longer characterized by last-minute panic or overproduction. Instead, the work carries the weight of considered reflection, possessing an economy of expression where every note, every line serves a clear, intentional purpose. This contrasts sharply with the maximalist approach of their earlier, insecure, fame-chasing years, suggesting that wisdom manifests as refinement through subtraction. The emotional payoff of this internal restructuring is the eradication of professional jealousy. When the protagonist observes others achieving rapid, spectacular success, the reaction is no longer one of competitive anxiety, but of detached interest, perhaps even empathy for the pressures those newcomers face. They recognize the early warning signs in the young stars, having worn those blinders themselves. This final, profound sense of emotional security, the knowledge that one's worth is intrinsic and not tied to the daily fluctuations of public favor, is the bedrock upon which the entire comeback is sustained. The film concludes, therefore, not with a definitive endpoint, but with a sustainable, mature rhythm of creation, proving that standing up again means learning how to walk at a sustainable pace. The narrative's final, subtle flourish concerns the protagonist's conscious decision regarding their public narrative moving forward, specifically how they choose to interact with the very idea of retirement or the inevitable conclusion of a public career. Having fought so fiercely to reclaim their voice, they must now define what continued relevance looks like outside the high-octane demands that nearly destroyed them. This manifests as a conscious pivot away from chasing icon status toward embracing the role of a venerable practitioner. This shift is best illustrated in their handling of retrospectives or biographical material. While earlier in the story, any mention of their past success would have triggered defensiveness or brittle pride, the protagonist now approaches these discussions with a gentle, almost anthropological detachment. When asked about the good old days, their description is less nostalgic yearning and more a nuanced explanation of the technical and emotional landscape of that era, dissecting the mechanisms of fame without romanticizing the suffering it entailed. This is the act of demystifying their own myth, allowing the public to see the scaffolding behind the facade, thereby dismantling the pressure for future perfection. The emotional texture of this acceptance is one of profound liberation, mixed with a quiet sense of melancholy, the acknowledgement that the passionate, reckless energy of youth is truly gone, but has been replaced by something far more durable. This melancholy is not despair, but the necessary shadow accompanying deep understanding. The audience senses that the protagonist is no longer trying to cheat time, but is actively collaborating with it, choosing quality engagement over quantity of output. This maturation can be visually encapsulated by the setting of the final, defining conversation or artistic choice. Instead of the sterile, high-tech environments of their past, perhaps the protagonist chooses a setting deeply connected to Indonesian tradition or nature, a quiet studio overlooking rice paddies, or a modest, historically significant theater known for its rigorous artistic standards. This physical environment reinforces the message. The value is now in the roots and the process, far removed from the transient glamour of the commercial center. Ultimately, Nonton Kembali Berdiri ends not with a declaration of eternal comeback, but with a graceful resignation to impermanence. The protagonist has learned that standing up is not about achieving an unassailable position, but about building a life where one can afford to sit down occasionally, knowing that the work and the self remain intact. The final scene suggests a future where the protagonist's presence in the industry is less about being the center of attention and more about being an anchor, a stable point of reference for authenticity in a constantly shifting cultural landscape. This enduring, quiet influence is the film's final, most powerful testament to true resilience. The narrative subtly threads a commentary on the ethics of representation in the protagonist's return, especially concerning how their personal narrative of struggle is consumed and potentially exploited by the media landscape they re-enter. Having faced professional ruin, the protagonist is now intensely aware of the narrative economy, how their vulnerability is now a marketable commodity. This awareness forces a defensive posture, not against criticism, but against the fetishization of their trauma. We see this in scenes where journalists or documentarians attempt to extract highly dramatic confessions about the darkest periods of their hiatus. The protagonist, now armed with the wisdom of having processed that darkness internally, responds not with theatrical disclosure, but with measured, almost clinical analysis. They refuse to offer up their deepest pain as entertainment fodder, consciously withholding the elements that would make for the most sensational headlines. This act of narrative self-possession is a quiet revolution against the culture of celebrity confessionals, symbolizing a mature boundary setting that protects the inner self forged during recovery. Emotionally, this resistance is fueled by a fierce protectiveness over the hard-won peace. The protagonist harbors a deep suspicion towards anyone offering effusive praise too quickly, reading it as an attempt to prematurely canonize the comeback before the work is truly done. This suspicion manifests as sharp, almost cynical eye contact, a momentary flicker of the old world weariness returning, quickly suppressed by the practiced calm of their new demeanor. They treat public engagement like negotiating a delicate treaty, necessary for survival, but requiring constant vigilance against hidden clauses. This ethical stance extends to their interactions with the media, promoting the new work. They insist on focusing conversations exclusively on the artistic merits of the current project, gently but firmly deflecting questions about past rivalries or personal drama. This deliberate redirection forces the audience and critics to engage with the art again rather than the scandal. It's a subtle but firm declaration that the recovery is complete only when the art supersedes the biography in public discourse. The character understands that true legacy isn't about what you survived, but what enduring, meaningful creation emerges from that survival. The final measure of their standing is the industry's reluctant respect for their refusal to perpetually perform their own suffering for public consumption. The narrative's final, crucial dimension involves the protagonist's reconciliation with the concept of national expectation, a weight uniquely heavy within the Indonesian creative sphere, where artistry often intersects with cultural duty. Having navigated the intensely personal crucible of failure and rebirth, the protagonist must now decide whether their reclaimed identity serves only the self, or if it carries an obligation to reflect the current artistic dialogue of the nation. This is less about fulfilling a mandate and more about offering their hard-won perspective back into the collective cultural consciousness. This resolution is visualized through the protagonist's choice of subject matter for their next major undertaking. It must be distinctly Indonesian, yet entirely contemporary. Perhaps they champion a narrative or musical form that tackles complex socio-political realities often skirted by previous generations seeking universal, easily consumable success. The protagonist, having seen the fragility of superficial fame, now risks engaging with material that is inherently localized and potentially divisive, precisely because they finally possess the emotional fortitude to handle any backlash. This represents the highest form of artistic courage, prioritizing cultural truth over broad market appeal, a trait admired in pioneering Indonesian filmmakers and writers who dared to challenge norms. The internal emotion driving this choice is a sense of profound gratitude, channeled into responsibility. The protagonist realizes that the privilege of their platform, momentarily lost, has been tentatively restored, and it demands an honest accounting. This feeling is not burdensome, but empowering. It reframes their personal struggle as a microcosm for broader societal introspection. They are no longer fighting against the ghost of their famous parent, but working to uphold the integrity of the artistic tradition they inherited, albeit through a radically updated lens. This final thematic beat is underscored by a deliberate shift in the film's visual palette when depicting this new work. If the earlier scenes were saturated with the artificial gloss of commercial production, the scenes surrounding this final project are shot with a raw, almost documentary-like intimacy, favoring deep shadows and natural textures that reflect the complex, often contradictory beauty of Indonesian life beyond the Jakarta bubble. The protagonist, now the orchestrator of this vision, appears grounded, their artistic focus absolute, unconcerned with whether the resulting product will be an immediate hit or a slow-burn cultural touchstone. The film implies that true artistic legacy is not secured by one comeback, but by a series of honest contributions that add genuine texture to the national artistic tapestry. The journey concludes with the protagonist finding their most significant role, not as a star to be admired, but as a vital, thoughtful contributor to the ongoing cultural conversation. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Complex Cine channel. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and give us a like. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Nonton Kembali Berdiri. The film unfolds with a palpable sense of ambition, centering on a figure whose journey is deeply etched with the highs and lows of creative pursuit. We see early glimpses of this protagonist navigating the demanding landscape of Indonesian cinema, a world where talent often contends with entrenched industry expectations. Their early work, perhaps a short film or an independent feature, already hinted at a distinctive visual style, a knack for capturing nuanced human emotion that set them apart from the more formulaic offerings of the time. This early success, however modest, fueled a relentless drive, an almost obsessive need to tell stories that resonated authentically with the Indonesian spirit, moving beyond mere commercial viability. As the narrative progresses, the focus shifts to a particular creative undertaking, a project that seems to represent the culmination of years of struggle and learning. This endeavor isn't just another film, it feels like a deeply personal excavation. We learn that the inspiration for this current work stems from a confluence of personal history and a desire to honor forgotten narratives within their community. One can sense the weight of influence from classic Indonesian auteurs, perhaps echoes of Teguh Karya's meticulous storytelling or the raw energy of early New Wave directors, filtered through a thoroughly modern lens. The director's dedication is almost monastic. There are montages showing exhaustive research, lengthy, sometimes contentious, script revisions, and the meticulous sourcing of locations that speak volumes about their commitment to verisimilitude. The central conflict arises not just from the external pressures of financing or studio interference, the usual antagonists in any artistic biography, but from an internal battle. The protagonist grapples with self-doubt, the persistent whisper that perhaps their vision is too niche, too uncompromising for a mass audience. This introspection is beautifully contrasted with the vibrant, often chaotic energy of the film's set itself. We observe the interactions with the cast, many of whom are themselves striving artists, perhaps newcomers the director has taken under their wing, recognizing a similar spark they once possessed. There's a touching scene where the director shares an anecdote about an early mentor who once told them, "The camera sees the truth, but only if you allow yourself to see it first." The production phase is shown as arduous. Weather, logistical nightmares, and creative disagreements test the protagonist's resolve. Yet, in these moments of near collapse, their true character shines through. They possess an almost stubborn resilience, a refusal to dilute the core message for expediency. This tenacity isn't born of arrogance, but from a profound belief in the necessity of the story being told in exactly the way it demands. Their history, marked by periods of obscurity, followed by bursts of critical acclaim, has seasoned them, making them less susceptible to fleeting trends. The final act of the film focuses on the premiere and the immediate aftermath. The tension is almost unbearable as the credits roll. We see the protagonist observing the audience reaction, not with vanity, but with a searching gaze, trying to gauge if the intended emotional bridge has been successfully built. The reaction, when it comes, is not necessarily a sweeping, universal ovation, but rather a profound, quiet recognition from those who understand the layers of artistry involved. The film concludes not with a definitive pronouncement of victory, but with a subtle understanding. The act of creation itself, the struggle to stand again after being knocked down, that is the true triumph. The protagonist steps away from the fanfare, already perhaps contemplating the next challenge, forever the eternal student of the moving image. The protagonist, whom we might call Surya, carries the visible markers of his vocation, the slight perpetual fatigue around the eyes that speaks of countless sleepless nights spent poring over rushes, and hands often stained faintly with ink from hurried script notes. His early inspirations weren't just the giants of world cinema. He often spoke in interviews, which we catch glimpses of, about the powerful street photography of the 1970s Jakarta scene, the way those photographers captured the unvarnished reality of daily life, a realism he sought to translate into moving pictures. This desire for authenticity meant he often clashed with producers keen on importing slicker, more internationally palatable aesthetics. As Surya steers this new, deeply personal project, we see the toll it takes on his personal life, a familiar sacrifice for those whose art demands totality. There are brief, poignant scenes showing missed calls from family or a quiet dinner eaten alone in a sparse apartment, the glow of a monitor reflecting in his intense gaze. His second-in-command, perhaps a seasoned cinematographer who has weathered similar artistic storms, acts as a necessary anchor, their rapport built on years of shared near failures and small victories. This cinematographer, maybe named Bhima, has an eye for composition that perfectly complements Surya's thematic focus, understanding that a carefully placed shadow can carry more narrative weight than pages of dialogue. The emotional core of the production revolves around a pivotal performance. Surya has insisted on casting an unknown, someone whose lived experience mirrors the vulnerability of the character he has written. Watching Surya work with this novice actor is revealing. He sheds his usual guarded demeanor, becoming intensely empathetic, patiently coaxing out the necessary rawness. He doesn't direct through shouts, but through shared vulnerability, offering up pieces of his own past struggles to create a safe space for the actor to excavate deep emotion. This process is slow, agonizingly so, testing the patience of the financiers who demand faster turnaround times. When the film finally moves into post-production, the struggle shifts from the physical constraints of the location to the metaphysical challenge of editing. Surya battles with his editor over pacing. Surya wants lingering shots that allow the audience to breathe in the atmosphere, while the editor argues for the necessity of forward momentum to keep the narrative taut. These arguments are less about ego and more about the rhythm of truth. Surya believing that truth often resides in the pauses, the unspoken moments between actions. We witness him spending days alone in the editing suite, sometimes scrapping entire, technically perfect sequences because they felt, in his own words, like decoration rather than architecture. The critical reception following the premiere is a microcosm of his career itself. There are critics who laud it as a masterpiece of understated social commentary, recognizing the subtle cultural signifiers woven into the production design, details he fought fiercely to preserve, like the specific wear pattern on a decades-old teak table, or the correct shade of paint for a specific regional government office. Conversely, some reviews dismiss it as impenetrable, too slow, too focused on the particularities of a small community to resonate broadly. Surya reads these reviews with a strange detachment. The external validation, or lack thereof, seems secondary to the internal certainty that he has honored the story. His relief isn't exuberant, it's a settling of internal pressure, the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a treacherous creative journey and arrived at the intended destination, however few the travelers who choose to follow that path. The final image is not of applause, but of Surya, back in a quiet room, sketching the very first few frames of a new idea, the cycle of creation eternally beginning anew. The atmosphere surrounding Surya during the festival circuit, following the premiere, is a strange mix of suffocating proximity and utter isolation. He moves through the crowded lobbies of international film markets like a ghost, polite but distant, his focus clearly internalized. We see him fielding relentless questions, many of which inevitably steer toward the commercial prospects or potential for remake. Questions he answers with a practiced, almost weary courtesy that betrays his disdain for such metrics. His mannerisms speak volumes, a habit of constantly adjusting the frame of his eyeglasses, as if trying to bring a blurry world into sharper focus, or the way he unconsciously rubs his thumb over a worn patch on his jacket, a small talisman from an earlier, scrappier filmmaking period. His relationship with his collaborators deepens under this scrutiny. Bhima, the cinematographer, acts as his shield, handling the more overtly promotional interviews, translating Surya's dense artistic intentions into slightly more digestible sound bites. It is through Bhima's eyes that we often see the real cost, the subtle tremor in Surya's hand after a particularly intense Q&A session, or the moments when he retreats entirely, finding solace only in the familiar glow of his editing monitor, even months after the picture is locked. The narrative subtly weaves in flashbacks to Surya's formative years in film school, not just the academic pursuits, but the hunger that drove him. There are recollections of sneaking into